Hello, everyone. This brief video lecture is going to cover the reading by color on ethics and aesthetics. Now, this reading, it may seem a bit abstract, a bit out there, but there's a lot from it that we can glean some further knowledge from. We'll put it that way. So one of the first things that I want to talk about as we get into ethics is how does and what this reading really covers is the ethics of literature, the ethics of writing, the ethics of reading. So one of the first things that we need to discuss is sort of the history of ethics within literature and how that has evolved. I have a quote here. This is from page 121 of the reading. A major role of literature has been to teach about life by offering a wide range of vicarious experiences and by exercising moral imagination. It is not so much that literature teaches us how to act as that it helps readers discover their own evaluative dispositions and appreciate the complexity of ethical response. What this is essentially saying is that for a long time, literature was meant to teach a moral lesson, hence the colloquialism, the cliche, the moral of the story is. But literature has always taught us about life, and readers have always read literature to learn about life. Literature, in and of itself, serves to enhance ethical reflection, the engagement between good and evil. That's a very black and white way of thinking about it, but we are constantly confronted with ethical questions, moral questions, when it comes to, we are constantly faced with these within literature and how we sort of digest literature. So one thing to think about is the distinction between morality and ethics. Morality, in a sense, is sort of this universal acceptance of right and wrong. That's what morality is. That's not necessarily what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about ethics, which is an openness to possibilities, an openness to interpretation. And as you've seen in some of the stories that we've read and a lot of other things that you've probably read, right and wrong is not necessarily black and white. There's some gray areas here. And that gray area is the context of the situation that our characters are in. Okay? So, taking that a step further, it is ethical for the reader to be open to possibilities. They need to be open. There has to be an openness. Okay? A little bit further into this section on ethics, we get into this idea of reparative reading by Eve Sedgwick. Many literary scholars, I would argue probably most literary scholars, assume that the reader should approach a piece of reading almost as a blank slate, being completely open, not bringing any of their baggage to the reading, which is impossible. It is impossible for us to completely shut out our lives when we begin reading. We can't turn off our unconscious or our subconscious. All of the fight you had with your significant other yesterday is still lingering there. Okay. So what Eve Sedgwick proposes is this idea of reparative reading, which is that reading should be a form of, should have almost therapeutic benefit. That readers, Eve Sedgwick's argument is based on the assumption that the readers are coming to their experience of reading in a depressed state. And reading itself is reparative, it's healthy, it's therapeutic. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into too many of the nuances of this, because I think while I love these readings that we've done by color, I think this section is a little overdone and states the obvious a little bit too much. But it's also not necessarily something that we tend to think about. There's this egocentrism, this anthropocentrism in literature where our protagonists, our stories, most of the time are human stories. Humans take the superior place in nature over other animals, over nature in most of the stories that we read. Or if they don't, if there's a children's book with dogs or cute little fish or whatever, they're given human qualities. So literature in and of itself is based in this place of egocentrism, of anthropocentrism. Earth is the center of these stories. I mean, unless you are, going out into the sci-fi realm, there's still our aliens in sci-fi stories tend to have human qualities. And that's, this isn't a bad thing. It's just the way it is. It's how we know how to write. We know how human consciousness works. We know how human emotion works. So that's how we write it. Okay. Now, that being said, a lot of non-human themes and non-human conflicts can be addressed in our literature. There's a lot of stories out there, a lot of movies out there, a lot of great literature out there that deals with sort of man versus nature, or man trying to understand nature, or man fighting to control nature. There's a lot of stories out there. It's a vast canon. And a lot of times these stories do tend to drive home the theme of humanity's destructive nature, destructive behavior over nature, I should say. And I had just listed some here: Jaws, Moby Dick, Twister, Jurassic Park. A lot of these have to deal with the conflict between humans and nature, but they mostly, I mean, some of them go out of their way to make nature evil, like in Jaws. Others tend to make nature sympathetic, or just realistic, okay? Post-human, which has to deal with the shifting definitions of human. There's a lot of talk out there about, and a lot of conjecture out there about what the next step in human evolution is going to be. And a lot of transhumanists and post-humanists believe that the next step in human evolution is going to be us integrating ourselves with technology. There are already scientists living in Europe, and I think that there's a fascinating story here. I actually sort of have an idea for a novel based around this, who have microprocessors implanted within their body, and they can actually, some of them actually have a USB port on their arm where they can plug in, basically plug these microprocessors into their computer to track sort of their heart rate, their monitoring, whatever. And if you think of the more consumer-based products that are out there, like the Google Glass thing from a couple years ago, our Fitbits that can track our heart rate, those sorts of things. So we're already beginning to do this. The issue with this is, so how's this going to affect our art? How's art going to change? I recently saw a show where it was discussed that a fairly basic artificial intelligence that was created, I forget where, I think it was in Sweden, was able to paint, was able to analyze paintings, understand what was aesthetically pleasing, and then create new works for humans to enjoy, okay? So post-human really comes down to a question of agency. We have agency over our lives. We're autonomous, we're rational, we're self-conscious, we possess free will, right? I mean, as far as we can generally argue, there's also the argument that we don't have free will because we are sort of enslaved by the institutions of our society. We have to work because we need money, that sort of thing. However, generally speaking, we have agency. We are, in the most that we possibly can be, we are in control of our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. All right? And the way that we move through life. So that boils down to that's what makes us human, is this agency. But we're already seeing that we can create agency in computer systems. So does that make them human? Or does that expand our idea of what agency is or what humanity is? So there's a lot of questions here, a lot of ethical questions about how technology is going to influence art and literature in the future. There's a great quote here on page 128. The primary function of the notion of the post-human is to mark a passage beyond the traditional conception of the human subject. Though studies of the post-human frequently draw on science fiction, cybernetics, and systems theory, the argument is not just that computers and other machines have changed the world, creating a situation where we are part of complex systems or circuits that we do not control. So here we're talking about losing our agency. The fundamental claim is that we have always been post-human, always other than that image of the human suggested by humanism. Computers and other devices have only made evident what was the case all along. The psyche with its drives, for example, was never a device that we controlled. Granted, today we increasingly experience ourselves as controlled by our machines as much as we control them. As I write this, my machine repeatedly summons me to read messages, which are mostly ads or announcements generated by other machines. In fact, it is the structure of the controller and the controlled that the notion of the post-human puts in question. So this is just a sort of a more a summary of what I was just saying, of how technology, and down here, how technological appendages change our ability as human. And technological appendages and distributed cognition is really interesting because if you think about it, we don't have to necessarily remember things anymore. I only have my no, I don't even have hers. I have my mother's cell phone number memorized. That's the only number other than my own that I know. You don't have to remember phone numbers anymore. You don't have to remember addresses anymore. I know my address and my mother's address. That's it. I don't know anybody else's address. We, generally speaking, our cognitive. My dogs are barking. Hold on a second. So, all right, I'm back. So, this is something else that we have to think about when it comes to ethics and art, or literature. We want to get specific. Is that our memory is distributed more widely now across devices, across systems? I'm sorry. All right, so with our cognition and our memories distributed across technology, portions of ourself distributed across technology, these technological appendages, this idea of post-human there's more questions, but we also get some more answers of what post-human really means, what it means to live in this post-human world. But the main questions that are still out there are how does this affect art? 20 years ago, if I wanted to write about something I had no knowledge of or that I have never seen before, I would have to imagine it. That incorporates much more of me than for me to just go Google, a sandy place with 3 moons in the background. Before I would have to imagine that. Now I can just Google it and write about what I see. That's kind of not the best example, but I think you get it, that in a post-human world, our consciousness is distributed much more widely, and there's less dependence on us to be the creators and the memories for, our art in our life. All right, so this is ethics. The next video will discuss aesthetics.